I wish I could say it all started with something big, like a fight or a betrayal, or even a moment of weakness you could name and tuck away under some neat little label like stress or loneliness, but that'd be too easy. What actually happened was that I walked into my own kitchen in a sweatshirt and saw my husband's nephew standing by the sink in nothing but a towel, water dripping from his hair, and something inside me stuttered in a way I hadn't felt in years. I didn't say anything right away. I think I was still trying to remember if I'd ever seen him like that before, back when he was still a teenager visiting on holidays, all limbs and awkward silences glued to his phone, oblivious to the room. But this wasn't that kid. This was someone else. Grown, taller than I remembered, broader in the shoulders, quiet in a way that felt deliberate now. He looked up and said, "Morning," just like anyone would. Like he wasn't standing there half naked with the fridge still open and steam from the bathroom curling into the hallway behind him. I mumbled something about coffee and turned my face toward the cabinet, because that's what you do when you feel a flush you can't explain. You move, distract, pretend. He didn't make a thing of it. Just grabbed a banana, said thanks for letting him crash while the dorm was closed for maintenance, and padded barefoot back toward the guest room like he hadn't just short-circuited something in my chest. That's the part that stuck with me, the rest of the day. Not his body or the water still clinging to his skin, but the way I couldn't find anything wrong with it. Like my brain was flipping through files looking for shame and came up blank. I tried to talk myself out of it later, after my husband got home and asked about dinner like usual. We'd been married 12 years, and most nights we moved around each other like furniture, comfortable, predictable, functional. Not in a bad way, not in the way people mean when they say they've fallen out of love, more like we'd both settled into a quiet kind of truce where nothing burned anymore and nothing froze either. Just room temperature. That night, I lay beside him in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how little I remembered the sound of my own heartbeat. I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean I literally tried to hear it and couldn't. Everything in me felt slow and quiet and suspended. The next morning, I tried to reset. Woke up early, tied my hair up, threw on my old house hoodie, and headed to the kitchen like always. I figured the best way to get over whatever weird chemical glitch had happened in my head was to treat him like any other guest. Polite, neutral, distant. But then he was there again. This time fully dressed in jeans and a white t-shirt, sitting at the table with his head tilted back, eyes closed, earbuds in. I don't know why I noticed the stretch of fabric across his chest or the fact that his jaw had filled out since last summer. I just did. And I hated myself for noticing. Absolutely hated it. I set the coffee pot down harder than I meant to. He startled, smiled sheepishly, pulled one earbud out. "Didn't hear you come in," he said. "Maybe try waking up with the rest of us," I shot back, sharper than I intended. He laughed under his breath and reached for a mug. "I like the quiet," he said. "It's better before the day starts." I wanted to say something sarcastic, something to break the spell that was starting to creep into the space between us, but the words didn't come. Just silence. And that stupid, unbearable awareness of being seen. Really seen. Like I hadn't been in years. The rest of that day felt off-kilter. Every time I walked past him, I felt my body adjusting without permission. Shoulders back, stomach tucked in, legs moving more deliberately. I caught myself checking my reflection in the hallway mirror and immediately wanted to slap the vanity out of my mouth. I wasn't supposed to care how I looked in my own house, especially not around a boy I'd known since he was 15. Later, when I told myself it was nothing, just hormonal or cabin fever or whatever excuse women our age are expected to default to, I remembered the way his eyes tracked me when I bent to grab a towel that had slipped off the chair. He didn't leer. He didn't smile. He just looked, then looked away like he knew he shouldn't have, but also like he wasn't sorry. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay next to my husband, who'd fallen asleep mid-show again, the glow of the TV flickering on his face. I stared at the ceiling and thought about the last time someone looked at me like I was still a woman, not a wife, not a placeholder in the room. And I knew, somewhere deep and unspoken, that if I wasn't careful, I'd let it happen again. Not Because I wanted to destroy my marriage. Not because I was desperate or stupid or impulsive, but because I had forgotten what it felt like to be noticed. Really noticed. And the second I remembered, I realized how much I missed it. It scared me, but not enough. The next morning, I kept myself busy on purpose, filling every hour with tasks that didn't need doing, wiping down already clean countertops, refolding laundry that had been folded the night before, trimming herbs in the backyard even though I knew we weren't going to cook anything that needed fresh basil. And every time I passed a mirror, I caught the same look in my eyes, that mix of confusion and hunger and guilt that didn't belong to me, or rather, hadn't for years. He stayed, out of the way mostly, working from his laptop in the guest room, headphones in, occasionally passing through to grab a bottle of water or a snack. Always polite, always casual, always that same quiet confidence I hadn't known he'd grown into. And I told myself I was imagining it. The way he lingered near the fridge while I washed dishes, the way his hand brushed my back lightly when reaching over the counter, the way his gaze sometimes hesitated a little too long before looking away. All of it I filed under coincidence, even though my body filed it somewhere else entirely. By early evening, I felt wrung out from the effort of pretending to be unaffected, and when my husband texted that he'd be working late again, I lied and said I was tired too, that I'd eat something light and call it an early night, but instead I stayed up, sitting on the sofa with the TV on low, not really watching, just listening to the hum of the house and trying to feel normal inside my own skin again. He walked in around 10, said he was going to grab tea before bed, and I said nothing. Didn't even look up right away, but I felt it. The moment he paused behind the couch, the moment he looked down at me like I was a question he hadn't quite decided. How to ask, "You okay?" he said. Simple as that. Not loaded or suggestive. Just a young man checking on someone who looked lost in her own living room. I nodded, smiled without showing teeth, told him I was just winding down, and he moved into the kitchen, filled the kettle, leaned against the counter while it boiled, his back to me. And for a second, I let my eyes trace the line of his shoulders through that thin cotton shirt, the way he stood so still, not shifting weight or fidgeting, just present, steady, like the air around him knew something I didn't. I hated myself for how long I looked. He brought his tea back into the living room, sat down in the chair across from me without asking, and we talked for a bit. Small things. Nothing close to dangerous. Just music and weather and the weird quietness of this part of town after dark. And it would have been harmless. Forgettable even, if not for the way our silences didn't feel like gaps anymore, but like decisions waiting to be made. Eventually, he said goodnight and I nodded, watching him walk down the hall, his cup still in his hand, and the second his door clicked shut, I exhaled like I'd been holding my breath all day. I told myself then and there I'd stop this nonsense. Stop reading into things. Stop inventing stories in the space between polite words and slow glances. But lying to yourself is easy when no one's watching. And the truth is, I didn't want to stop. Not really. Because for the first time in a long time, I felt something sparking beneath the surface of who I had become. That night, I lay awake long after the house had gone still, the ceiling fan casting slow shadows across the room, and I replayed every moment, every look, every touch that might have lasted longer than it should have. And instead of pushing the thoughts away like I usually did, I let them stay a while. Let them stretch out and settle in, and I didn't cry or panic or make promises to myself. I just lay there, silent, warm, alive. And I think that's when I knew. Something had already shifted, and I wasn't going to shift it back. I told myself it would just be a minute, that I could carry the box on my own if I held it from the bottom and kept my knees bent. But as soon as I shifted my weight to lift it, I felt it tip slightly, and then he was there behind me, his arm sliding firmly around my waist to stabilize the box, and his hand landing a little too close to my stomach. Not rough or intentional, but not neutral either, because the second his fingers settled against the fabric of my shirt, I stopped breathing like someone had hit a switch inside me and my whole body went still. Not from surprise, but from something far more complicated than that. He looked over my shoulder like he hadn't just touched me like that. Not in a way anyone else would have noticed, but I noticed. I noticed every single second of it. And when he asked, "You good?" with that half smile that made him look younger and older at the same time, I nodded too quickly and stepped back like I needed distance, when really what I needed was to stop thinking about the way my skin was still remembering where his hand had been. He carried the box to the counter, lifted it like it weighed nothing, and I tried to shake off the heat crawling up my neck by rinsing a bowl in the sink and focusing way too hard on a stain that had already been scrubbed clean. Later, when I walked into the kitchen again to make lunch, he had music playing from his phone, low but rhythmic, and he was washing dishes with his sleeves pushed up, his forearms flexing just slightly with each movement, and I said, "Can you turn that down a little?" Not because it was too loud, but because I needed something to break the hum that had started building in my chest the second I saw him there like that. He didn't argue, didn't apologize, just grinned without turning around and said, "You getting quieter, or am I getting louder?" And I didn't answer because I was too focused on the way that comment hung in the air between us like a thread neither of us had pulled yet, but both of us could feel stretching tighter. That evening, we ended up side by side at the sink again, peeling carrots and rinsing lettuce like some version of domestic routine we'd never rehearsed but had no trouble falling into. And at one point, our hands bumped above the colander, and neither of us moved back. Just let them rest there for half a second too long, his knuckles grazing mine, before I reached for a towel I didn't need and turned away. He leaned closer, not touching this time, just watching my face, and asked with a tone too casual to be accidental, "You ever get tired of always having to control everything?" And I laughed, not because it was funny, but because the question felt like it came from a place he had no right to touch. And I said, "I'm just an adult, and adults don't play with boundaries," even though I knew we already were, just not out loud yet. Later that night, I walked into the bathroom right after he'd been in there, and the mirror was still fogged near the edges, and the air was warm with that mix of soap and heat that clings to the skin long after a shower, and when I placed my hand on the edge of the sink without thinking, I realized it was still damp where his hands had been. I didn't pull away. I stood there longer than I needed to, my fingers resting on the sink where his had just been, my palm warming slowly from the ceramic that still held the imprint of his body heat, and it should have felt mundane or forgettable like any other room in any other day. But something about the closeness of that space, the leftover moisture on the mirror, the scent of his soap still hovering in the air, made me feel like I'd walked in too late and too early at the same time, like I was borrowing a moment that wasn't mine but couldn't resist touching anyway. I stared at my own reflection and saw something unfamiliar in my eyes, something quiet but restless, something I hadn't seen since my 30s and had trained myself to live without. The look of someone still wanting, not anything in particular, just the feeling of being fully awake inside her own skin. When I finally left the bathroom and crawled into bed, I told myself I was just tired, that the tension wasn't real, that I was misreading everything the way people do when they feel stuck or lonely or invisible. But when I pulled the blanket up to my waist and looked down at my legs curled together, I felt the muscles in my thighs trembling softly under the cotton, and it wasn't cold or fear or even shame. It was anticipation, low and slow and dangerous, the kind that didn't ask permission because it had already decided what it was. I turned off the light and lay in the dark listening to the sounds of the house, the quiet click of the refrigerator, the faint shift of floorboards, the soft hum of air through the vents, and I waited for it to pass, the pulse under my ribs, the flush at the base of my throat, the echo of his voice in the hallway. But none of it did, not really. It just curled up inside me and settled deeper. I thought about waking my husband, just to feel something solid and known, something safe that didn't require interpretation or self-questioning. But when I turned my head toward his side of the bed, he was already facing away from me. One hand under his pillow, his breathing deep and rhythmic and far too familiar, and I knew I couldn't reach for him without lying to both of us. I stayed in bed for another hour, maybe 2, then finally gave up and pulled on my robe, made my way to the kitchen like I always did when sleep refused to come, barefoot and quiet, expecting to be alone the way I usually was. But the light above, the stove was already on, and he was standing there in a t-shirt and flannel pants, barefoot too, holding a glass of water with one hand and leaning against the counter like he'd been waiting for someone but hadn't decided who. He didn't startle or move when I stepped in, just turned his head slightly, met my eyes without hesitation, and said nothing, because he didn't have to. The silence was already doing the talking. I cleared my throat, adjusted my robe even, though it wasn't falling open, more out of reflex than modesty, and said the first thing that came to mind, not because it mattered, but because the weight between us needed some kind of crack. You really need to learn how to turn lights off when you leave a room. He didn't smile right away, just looked at me like he wasn't sure if it was a joke or a challenge, then finally said, calm and even, and maybe you need to learn how to turn tension off when you walk in. Neither of us laughed. We just stood there, still, listening to the fridge hum, the faucet drip, and the space between us expand and contract like something alive. He'd started wearing those sleeveless shirts more often lately, the soft gray, kind that clung in the right places and sagged in the others just enough to feel unintentional. And maybe it was just laundry rotation or summer heat or his usual comfort routine, but it didn't feel accidental anymore. Not when he walked into the room rubbing his neck after waking up late. Not when I could see the muscles in his arms flexing as he stretched one side to the other. Not when his voice still carried the weight of sleep, and his feet moved slowly across the kitchen tiles like he didn't know or didn't care that someone else was watching every shift of his shoulder blades and every quiet breath that rose beneath his collarbone. I tried to keep my hands busy and my eyes busier, organizing the spice drawer even though nothing was out of place, checking the mail and reading nothing in it, standing too long by the open fridge because I knew that if I stopped moving for too long, I would start feeling everything again, and there was already enough of that buzzing under my skin to make me wonder how many more quiet mornings like this I could get through before something cracked. He reached above me while I was rinsing a mug in the sink, his body pressing just close enough to be felt, but not so close that I could name it as wrong. And I knew he didn't need help reaching the shelf. He never had. But his hand steadied itself lightly on my shoulder as he stretched, his fingers resting against the curve of my arm with a pressure that wasn't firm but wasn't light either, and I should have moved or spoken or even laughed it off, but I didn't do anything. At all. I just stood there feeling the weight of his presence behind me and the warmth of his skin through the thin fabric of my shirt and the way his breath fell against the back of my neck, and it wasn't imagined because when I turned to look at him, he didn't flinch or pretend like he hadn't done it. He looked right at me, his face too close and too calm, and his eyes didn't dart away like someone caught in a moment they didn't expect. They stayed exactly where they were, locked onto mine like we'd just both arrived in the same place. At the same time, and before I even registered what I was doing, I heard my own voice break the silence between us, low and thin and completely without defense, asking, "You don't feel anything at all?" And his answer came with the kind of certainty that only made things worse. His voice steady and level and quiet in a way that carried weight without volume as he said, "You're not asking me that because you want to hear no." I didn't reply, not out loud, because I couldn't pretend anymore that this wasn't happening, or that it wasn't me pulling it forward with every glance, every pause, every time I let myself stand a little too still or a little too close. And something in me gave up right then, not dramatically or consciously, just quietly, like a drawer sliding open without a sound, and I stepped forward with no plan and no excuse, lifted my hand lightly against his chest not to push him away, but to feel the warmth I knew would be there. And when I leaned in, I did it without hesitation, because some part of me had already crossed that line days ago. His lips didn't meet mine with confusion or caution. They met me like he'd already replayed this moment in his mind more than once, and I kissed him deeper than I meant to, not soft or shy or testing, but with pressure and heat and a hunger I hadn't felt in over a decade. And the second it happened, I felt everything at once. The thudding in my chest, the tightness behind my ribs, the ache in my stomach that had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with being seen and wanted and real for the first time in years. But it only lasted 2 seconds, maybe 3, before I pulled back with a breath caught hard in my throat and my body frozen in a way that felt more like collapse than retreat. And the moment shattered not because he stopped it, but because I had to, because something in me screamed that it was already too far and yet not nearly far enough. And I looked at him like I didn't know who he was, even though I had been the one who crossed the space between us. "Oh my God," I whispered before I could stop it, before the weight of it settled in completely, and I took a half step back with my hands half raised as if that might undo what had just happened, and I said it out loud without thinking. "What am I doing? Jesus Christ, I'm a grown woman and you're just a kid. This is wrong. It's disgusting. I don't recognize myself right now." And I hated the sound of my own voice for being panicked and guilty, but not sorry enough to unfeel what I'd felt. He didn't flinch or apologize, or step back the way I half expected him to. He just stood there breathing slowly through his nose like he was trying to stay still for both of us. And when I looked at his face, I didn't see confusion or shock or even guilt. I saw something steadier than that, something almost unbearably calm, as if this wasn't a mistake to him but a moment that had finally landed where it had been headed all along. And when he spoke, it wasn't defensive or smug or even surprised. It was simple, measured, too honest for how my heart was thudding. As he said, "But you didn't stop either." And that sentence slid under my skin in a way that made it impossible to lie to myself anymore, because he was right and we both knew it. I took another step back because I needed space to breathe again, needed air that didn't still carry the shape of his mouth or the weight of what I'd let happen, and I turned away so fast I nearly knocked over the salt container near our stove, catching it mid-fall with the kind of shaking hands you only get when something inside you has finally caught up to what your body did first. And I muttered something I can't remember, maybe his name or just a half word that didn't finish itself, and I left the room without looking back, without asking if he understood what it meant that I couldn't stay in the same space with him for another minute. In the hallway, I reached for the nearest piece of clothing I could find, one of the loose sweaters I usually threw on when the AC made the house too cold, and I pulled it over my tank top like covering skin could erase memory, like fabric could, make me decent again. And as I zipped it halfway up my chest, I realized my fingers were still trembling, not from fear or shame, but from the leftover pulse of contact, from the ghost of a kiss I didn't regret even though I wanted to. I walked into the bathroom and closed the door behind me gently, not slamming it or locking it or making a scene, because scenes are for people who don't already know the damage is done. And I turned on the light and faced myself in the mirror, like I was bracing for someone else to appear, someone older or harder or more cruel, but instead I just saw myself, pale and barefaced, mouth still parted slightly like it hadn't quite recovered, eyes rimmed with something between horror and heat. And I stared at my own reflection for what felt like minutes before I finally whispered it under my breath. 1 second. Just one stupid second, and I erased 10 years of marriage. And the silence after that was so heavy it felt like a second voice. I leaned on the edge of the sink, pressing both palms flat against the ceramic, grounding myself in the cold of it, in the steadiness of a surface that hadn't moved even though I had. And I tried to count to 5, then 10, tried to slow my breathing the way I'd seen in a video about calming the nervous system. But every time I closed my eyes, all I saw was the exact angle of his jaw when he tilted his head toward me, the exact softness of his lips before pressure replaced hesitation, and the feeling of his hand resting flat on the side of my hip like it had belonged there for years. I should have cried, but I didn't. Not yet, because what I felt wasn't grief or panic. It was a quiet kind of collapse that moved too slowly to name, the kind that didn't come from shock but from recognition. Because no matter how many times I told myself it was a mistake, I couldn't erase the truth that I had wanted it. Not just in that room, not just in that second, but in the days leading up to it, in the glances I didn't cut short, in the silences I didn't fill, in the moments I let stretch long enough to become something they were never meant to be. I washed my face not because I needed to, but because I had to do something with my hands, and as I patted my skin dry with the towel and caught one last look at myself in the mirror, I didn't feel ruined, not exactly, but I did feel cracked. Like a cup that still held water, but only if you didn't touch it too hard or too long. And I knew without question that whatever came next wouldn't be about repair. It would be about covering the damage well enough that no one else could see the fault lines. I walked back to my bedroom slowly, hoping the air in the hallway would cool the flesh on my skin before I crossed the threshold, and when I passed the kitchen I didn't look in, didn't pause, didn't check to see if he was still there because I couldn't afford to know. Not then. Not with my body still humming from memory and my mind too loud with words like mistake and reckless and ruined that hadn't yet made space for the word real, even though that's what it had felt like. Realer than anything in a very long time. I climbed into bed beside my husband without turning on the light, pulled the blanket over my chest like armor, turned my face toward the wall and listened to his breath deepen beside me, steady and oblivious and safe. And I wondered how many nights I had left before the gap between what I'd done and what he knew finally narrowed enough to become a question I couldn't answer, without shattering something that couldn't be put back together. We moved around each other that morning like people who had said too much without using any words, his footsteps soft on the floor, mine deliberate and measured, as if by walking slower I could somehow undo the way my lips had found his the day before. But it didn't work like that, because every time I caught sight of him near the fridge or leaning down to untie his shoes or reaching for something on the counter, my chest tightened in that same familiar way, the way it had when his hand rested on my hip and his mouth pressed against mine like he'd known how I would taste long before I let him learn it for real. We didn't speak much, just enough to pass for polite, just enough to keep the silence from getting sharp, but the tension had changed texture. It wasn't just possibility now, it was memory stretched thin over every glance, every movement, every moment I spent pretending that the kiss hadn't happened, even though it had happened exactly the way I wanted it to. And I kept telling myself it had to end now, that I had to stop this, that one step further would make everything irreversible. But I didn't leave the room when I could have. I didn't close the distance either. I just hovered in that in-between space like a person frozen mid-fall, watching the ground rise slowly to meet her. I lingered longer than usual in the kitchen, told myself I was just rearranging the drawers or wiping down the stove or checking expiration dates in the pantry, all things I could have done later or never, but I didn't want to leave the room, because he was there and I liked the way he leaned on the counter, pretending not to look at me while I pretended not to notice that I'd chosen a thinner shirt that morning, one that hugged tighter at the waist, one I hadn't worn since before. I got married, the kind you only put on when you want someone to see something you're not ready to name. He didn't say anything for a while, just watched from the other side of the kitchen island, arms crossed, head tilted, lips pressed together like he was holding something back or deciding if it was worth saying at all. And finally he asked, in a voice too steady to be casual, "Are you waiting for me to come closer again?" I could have laughed or deflected or pretended I hadn't heard, but instead I turned to face him fully, arms crossed to mirror his without meaning to, and said, "I'm waiting for you not to." And the moment the words left my mouth, I knew. They weren't true, or not entirely, because there was something in my stance, in the way I held my weight on one foot with the other angled toward him, in the way I didn't walk away even though the hallway was just behind me, that betrayed everything I was trying to say with my mouth. He took a step forward, not fast or forceful, just enough to close some of the distance, and he didn't ask permission this time, didn't announce what he was about to do. He just reached out slowly and let the side of his fingers brush the outside of my elbow, a touch so light it could have passed for an accident if not for the way his hand lingered just a second longer than it had to. And when I didn't pull away, he let his palm settle there, warm and steady against my sleeve, like he already knew I wouldn't stop him. My breath hitched just slightly, but I didn't move, didn't blink, didn't speak, because I knew that if I moved at all, I'd either step into him or bolt from the room, and I wasn't sure which one I was more afraid of. So I just stood there, letting his hand rest on me like we were both holding some silent agreement in our bodies. And I heard myself say quietly but clearly, "If I just stay still." It doesn't count, right? He smiled, not cruelly or playfully, but with something that felt closer to understanding, and said, "No, it doesn't." And I nodded like we'd both agreed to a lie we were too deep in to challenge now, and we stood there in that charged silence, his hand still on my elbow, my heart still in my throat, until he let go first, stepped back without looking at me again, and walked out of the room with slow, measured steps like nothing had happened even, though everything had. I didn't follow him. I just stood there with my arm still tingling and my breath caught behind my ribs and the silence of the kitchen wrapped around me like something alive and listening. I stayed in the kitchen long after he left, not because I had anything left to do, but because moving felt too final, too much like acknowledging that whatever line we were pretending not to see had already been crossed in silence. And as the house settled into late-day stillness with the light turning gold at the edge of the window panes, I found myself sitting at the table with my hands flat against the wood, staring past the salt and pepper shakers and trying to remember what it felt like to be clean, not in the moral sense exactly, but in that rare quiet way when you know you haven't yet done something you'll carry around like a bruise under your skin. Upstairs, I could hear the sounds of drawers opening and closing, the soft thud of a door, the shifting of footsteps, and every little noise felt loaded, not with meaning, but with presence, like he was still inside this moment with me even though he'd left the room. And I hated how much that comforted me more than it frightened me, because I should have been afraid of what I was becoming. But instead, I was just awake. I pressed my fingers to the inside of my wrist where his hand had rested, and I could still feel that brief, unremarkable contact like an echo. Not because the touch itself meant anything, but because I had allowed it, not just in that moment, but in the series of choices that had come before it. The glances, the clothes, the silences I hadn't filled, and the way I had remained still, not by accident, but by intention. And that intention, more than anything else, was the thing I couldn't stop thinking about. It wasn't that he had reached for me. It was that I had stayed exactly where I was, had let him linger without protest, had met his gaze with the kind of permission that never needed words. And when I said what I said, if I just stay still, it doesn't count. I knew even then that it was a lie, not just to him, but to myself, because of course it counted, it all counted. And the fact that he understood the game without mocking it made me feel more exposed than if he had called me out directly. The rest of the evening passed in the kind of haze that only comes when your body is on autopilot, but your mind is still caught in a loop, so I made dinner without tasting it, watched half a show without hearing the dialogue, folded laundry with my eyes on the floor, and all the while my phone sat silent on the table beside me like a sealed envelope, daring me to open it, to do something I could still technically avoid but didn't want to. It was almost midnight when I finally picked it up, not with some dramatic gesture or impulsive wave of emotion, but with the calm certainty of someone who knew she was no longer looking for permission. And I opened our message thread, the one still blank from earlier that week, the one I hadn't touched since before everything started shifting in the spaces between us, and I typed one word that felt both too small and too dangerous. Sorry. I stared at it for a few seconds, not because I wasn't sure I meant it, but because I wasn't sure what version of me was apologizing. The woman who wanted it to stop or the woman who didn't. And then I hit send, watched it disappear into the digital silence between us, and immediately regretted not saying more, not being braver, not clarifying whether I meant for the look, for the pause, for staying in the kitchen too long, or for not running when I still had time to. His reply came faster than I expected, and I saw his name light up the screen again, followed by two words that were so simple they almost made me laugh. For what? I didn't respond, not because I didn't have an answer, but because I had too many. And each one came with its own consequence, with its own ripple of truth that would take us further away from plausible denial and deeper into the place where we both had to choose what this would become. And in that moment, I wasn't ready to decide anything out loud. Instead, I turned off the lamp, lay down beside my husband who was already asleep, his hand curled loosely near his chest like it always did, his breathing deep and calm and completely unaware of the fact that the woman next to him was carrying a secret that hadn't even become an action yet, just a possibility that pulsed louder than guilt and heavier than logic. I closed my eyes and saw his question again, not on the screen but behind my eyelids, bright and sharp like something cut into glass. For what? And I knew that if I ever answered, it wouldn't be an apology, it would be a confession. It was barely past 4 in the afternoon when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, and I saw my husband's name flash across the screen with that casual rhythm of a man checking in like, always. And when I answered, trying to keep my voice steady despite the way my pulse had started to build since breakfast, he told me he was already on the road, that meetings wrapped up early, that he'd be home by dinner, maybe even before sunset. And I said that sounded good. I said it the way wives do when they've spent the day keeping everything in order. But even as I spoke, I could feel the panic settle into my bones. Not because I had something to hide in that moment, but because I knew I was seconds away from not being able to. I ended the call, placed the phone screen down beside the folded laundry pile, and turned back toward the living room where he, my husband's nephew, the boy who had become a man too quietly, was standing barefoot on the rug, holding a pillow in one hand and a towel in the other, waiting for me to finish sorting the last load before we put the sheets back on the guest bed. We didn't speak as we worked, and the silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was heavy and expectant, and I moved slower than I needed to, folding towels with deliberate care, smoothing corners I would normally ignore because I could feel his eyes on me again. Not in the way boys look when they're curious, but in the way men look when they already know the answer to the question they haven't asked. When he leaned past me to grab the fitted sheet from the chair, his hand brushed the side of my waist with the kind of pressure that felt accidental only if I wanted it to, and I turned to look at him, heart thudding in my ears, and before I could speak, before I could step back or forward or sideways, I heard myself say it in a voice that didn't sound quite like mine. "We can't do this. We both know that." And my eyes met his as I added, "We're not supposed to want this," even though the want had already settled under my skin like a fever I'd stopped trying to break. He didn't answer, not with words, and I didn't stop him when he leaned in, mouth meeting mine not with hesitation but with intent, and I kissed him back because something in me had already crossed the room long before my body did. And the second our mouths met, I felt every quiet moment from the last 2 weeks crash into that single breathless second, like it had all been building toward this one collapse. The kiss wasn't gentle. It wasn't testing or cautious or curious. It was already too much, already full of the things we hadn't dared to name. And when I reached for his shirt and felt the muscles in his back tense under my fingers, I didn't stop myself. I didn't pause to think about where I was or what I was doing. I just pulled him closer like something primal had taken hold of my better judgment and shredded it beyond recognition. We stumbled backward onto the sofa, and the laundry I had just folded tumbled to the floor, ignored and silent, as I tugged the throw blanket aside and pressed my palm flat against his chest, my breath catching as I whispered, "If you're waiting for me to say no, I won't." And he looked down at me, his eyes darker than I'd ever seen them, and said, "If you don't stop me, I won't stop either," to which I responded, already pulling him into me, "I haven't stopped. In days." And then it all blurred, his hands finding skin that hadn't been touched like this in years, his mouth trailing from mine to my jawline and lower, my legs shifting under his weight as I arched toward him, not with shame, but with need. A need. So old and so buried, it felt like exhaling something I'd been holding in since before I knew I needed to. And just as I felt my back press deeper into the cushions, just as my hands moved up under the hem of his shirt, the phone buzzed again on the kitchen counter, that familiar vibration slicing through the moment like a warning siren I'd forgotten how to obey, and I froze for half a second, eyes wide and breath caught, before reaching blindly for it, voice trembling as I answered, "Hey," with what I hoped sounded like casual breathlessness but came out hoarse and high. He paused, my husband, and then asked, "What are you doing?" And I swallowed the lump in my throat and replied, "Just ironing." Catching up on laundry. Trying to sound light, normal, unbothered, while I wiped my mouth with the sleeve of my shirt, heart pounding like it might betray me all on its own. There was silence, just long enough to send a chill through me, before he asked, sharper this time, "Are you alone?" And I answered too fast, "Yeah, of course." And the moment the lie left my mouth, I knew he didn't believe it, not because of what I said, but because of how I said it. And then his voice shifted, cold and precise, as he said, "I'll be home in 10 minutes. The second I hung up the call, the air in the room changed like pressure dropping before a storm, and for a moment we just stared at each other, me sitting upright now, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth, and him leaning over, me with one hand still braced against the couch cushion and the other frozen in place near my thigh. His expression not panicked, but alert, as if he already knew something had shifted, but hadn't decided whether to move forward or disappear completely. And I whispered that he had to go, that my husband was almost home, that this had gone too far, and he nodded without speaking, standing up slowly like every movement now had to be exact and calculated and silent. And I grabbed the laundry basket, off the floor, hands trembling as I shoved a towel over my chest to cover the stretched fabric of my shirt, which had slid too far down one shoulder. I could feel my breath catching as I moved around the room, trying to clean up the evidence of the moment, not because anything had happened fully, but because enough had, enough sweat, enough hands, enough urgency left in the cushions and in the angle of the blinds where they'd shifted just enough to let in the late evening sun. And I didn't hear the car pull up, but I felt it before it even stopped. The slow gravel crunch of tires pressing into the driveway. The sound of the engine clicking off, the door shutting just a little too hard, and I didn't have time to fix anything else. I was still bent over near the sofa pretending to sort the laundry when I saw movement through the window. Not clear at first, but fast and direct. And then my husband's face appeared on the other side of the glass, not pressed up against it, but close enough to see everything. And in that instant, I saw myself as he must have seen me. Flushed, shirt wrinkled and pulled tight in all the wrong places, his nephew still near the couch. Too close, too present, half turned as if trying to escape the frame of guilt, but too late to do it convincingly. I froze, still gripping a towel in one hand and my breath in the other, and then the front door burst open with a sound so loud it didn't belong to our house. It belonged to a house that had cracked, and he stepped inside with his hand clenched. Around his keys, voice rising before he even crossed the threshold, shouting words that didn't sound like his, not because of volume, but because of the betrayal inside them. You? In my house? And I flinched not at the rage, but at the accuracy of the question, because it wasn't just about space, it was about belonging. He didn't hit anyone, didn't throw fists, but he grabbed his nephew by the shirt collar and shoved him backward into the wall, not hard enough to injure, but hard enough to make a sound that echoed through the hallway. And the boy, the man, didn't fight, didn't speak, didn't even lift his hands. Just stared back with that same unreadable expression that now looked like cowardice. And the next second, my husband let go, shoved him aside, and turned to me like he expected me to offer something, a reason, an explanation, a scream, anything. But I had nothing except wait, and please, and it's not. And he interrupted with something that cut sharper than anything else that day, his voice quiet now, flat and hollow and done, saying, "You're not mine anymore." He didn't ask questions, didn't check his phone, didn't slam things around like in movies or books or fights you think people are supposed to have when they've been betrayed. He just turned toward the door, opened it, stepped out like he had somewhere more urgent to be than the wreckage of the marriage he was leaving behind, and let the screen door slam shut behind him with a sound so final I could feel it in my bones before I even registered that he hadn't looked back. I stood there in the middle of the living room with the light fading around me, one hand still gripping the side of the laundry basket, and the other pressed flat against my chest like I was trying to stop my own heart from leaving too. And he was gone. The house was quiet. The hallway was empty. The nephew was nowhere now, vanished like smoke. And all I could hear was my own breathing in a space that no longer felt like home, but like a crime scene I hadn't meant to walk into and couldn't find the way out of anymore. He came back only once after that night. Not to talk, or to fight, or to ask for an explanation I couldn't have given anyway, but to pack his things in silence, methodically, like a man moving out of a hotel room instead of the home he'd built over 10 years, his face unreadable and distant, his mouth pressed into a line that refused even the dignity of bitterness. And when I stood in the doorway of the bedroom watching him fold his button-down shirts with the same care he used to fold my sweaters after laundry day, I opened my mouth twice and said nothing both times, because there was nothing left to offer except apology. And even that would have landed like noise on stone. He didn't shout, didn't ask me why, didn't call me names, and maybe that was worse because his silence carved out a space I had to live in now. One where every memory echoed louder than the last. And when he was done, when the bags were zipped and the drawers stood open and bare, he took one last look at the closet, at the nightstand, at the bed we had shared even in distance, and said only, "I've removed access to the accounts," before walking out the front door without saying my name, without saying goodbye. And when I finally walked to the window to watch his car pull away, I realized I hadn't even asked where he was going. The nephew, no, I don't call him that anymore even in my mind, didn't stay either, not after that morning, not after the front door slammed and my husband's car disappeared down the road like it was escaping the weight of my name. Because by the time I came back into the living room, that boy, that man, that body I had pulled into my own house and into my own mistake, was already gone. And when I called his name once, just once, into the emptiness of the hallway, I already knew he wouldn't answer. His parents came for him 2 days later, not because they knew everything, but because they knew enough. And they didn't knock when they arrived. They just called from the curb and waited in the car while he walked out with his duffel bag slung over his shoulder and his hood up over his head like shame could be zipped and worn. And I didn't see his face, not once. Because I didn't go to the window this time. I just stood at the back of the kitchen holding a glass of water I couldn't drink and listening to the sound of tires peeling away like a verdict. The silence that settled in the house after that was the kind that didn't invite music or distraction or background noise. It was the kind of silence that rearranged your thoughts, that made the clock sound louder and the refrigerator hum unbearable. And when the email came from my husband's sister the next morning with no greeting, no warmth, no signature, just one flat question: "Do you even understand what you've done?" I stared at the words for nearly an hour before closing the laptop without replying, because there are some things you understand so completely they become part of your blood. At work, people didn't ask questions. Not out loud anyway. But the change was immediate. The glances that stopped mid-motion, the voices that dropped when I entered the break room, the sudden shift of conversation when I walked by. And within a week, I told them I needed to resign due to family circumstances, and the manager nodded too quickly, her voice overly careful. And no one said goodbye when I left the office for the last time with a cardboard box full of nothing I cared to keep. That evening, I sat on the floor in the laundry room wearing one of my husband's old t-shirts, the fabric worn and soft and full of a scent that no longer belonged to anyone who came home to me. And as I stared into the washing machine spinning, quietly in front of me, I remembered the exact moment I could have pulled back and didn't. The exact second I felt his hand on my hip and let myself lean into it instead of away. The exact breath I chose to take instead of speak. And I whispered, out loud to no one, I didn't stop. I didn't even want to. And the words didn't sound like regret. They sounded like a fact that had waited too long to be spoken. I hadn't expected him to write. Not after the way he left. Not after the silence that wrapped around his absence. Like a warning I wasn't allowed to interpret. But the message came late one night, long after I'd stopped checking my inbox for anything except bills and automated reminders. And when I saw his name, not just his first but the last two, the family name that didn't belong to me anymore, I felt something twist deep in my chest, not with hope or shame, but with that empty curiosity of someone who has already lost the outcome and is now just reading what's left of the wreckage to understand the shape of it. He didn't ask how I was or what had happened after. He didn't talk about his parents or my husband or the fallout that had cracked around us in slow, widening circles. He only wrote one paragraph, just long enough to sting but too short to hold on to, and in it he said, "You made me feel like I was alive. Like there was something in me that wasn't just quiet and obedient and invisible. But you're not mine now and you were never really his. And whatever you are now, you're not anyone's." And then he signed his name like it mattered, like the same fingers that had touched my skin could still write something clean. I closed the message without replying and sat on the edge of my bed with my arms wrapped around my knees like I was trying to fold myself into something smaller, something easier to store away. And I didn't cry because the part of me that used to know how had dried out somewhere between the front door slamming and the office lights turning off for the last time, and instead I just stared at the floor and listened to the sound of the house breathing without me. The next morning, I woke before sunrise without meaning to, and I didn't make coffee or check my phone or turn on the news like I used to. I just walked barefoot through the hallway and out into the garden wearing nothing but a faded nightshirt, and the weight of choices I couldn't unsay, and the grass was damp and cold and stuck to the soles of my feet as I moved across it slowly, like someone walking back through a dream they wished they hadn't woken up from. I stopped near the edge of the yard where the overgrowth had started reclaiming the space we never got around to fixing, and I looked up at the kitchen window from outside for the first time, the same window where sunlight used to pour in while he made coffee and I pretended not to watch him do it with the kind of quiet devotion that disappears long before love does. And the glass looked different from this angle, not reflective or warm, but flat and closed. And I thought about all the mornings I had wasted inside that frame, waiting for something I couldn't name. I stood there for a long time, arms folded against the chill, my breath visible in the early light. And I didn't move because there was nothing to move toward anymore, just echoes and unfinished sentences and the memory of my own voice saying things I hadn't really meant to say out loud, like, I know it's wrong and this isn't who I am, when the truth was I had known what it was and I had done it anyway. I said the word again now, quiet and sharp against the stillness of the yard. Sin. And it didn't sound like confession. It didn't sound like religion or punishment or cleansing. It sounded like inventory. Like a label you put on a box. You already packed and sealed, and I followed it with a thought I didn't say out loud but heard just as clearly, that between the moment you whisper the word wrong and the moment your hand actually moves, there is always 1 second, one space, one choice, and I used mine to ruin everything I had, and that single second was all it took for me to become someone who belonged nowhere. I looked back toward the window one last time, not to see inside, but to see myself from the outside, to imagine the version of me that still lived in that house, still stood at the counter, still reached for the laundry basket, still smiled when the phone rang, and I felt nothing for her except distance because she was gone, and the version that was left was barefoot in the garden with cold toes and an empty inbox and a name no one was saying anymore, and even that felt like a mercy. I turned away and walked back across the grass slowly, not because I was tired, but because there was no reason to hurry. And when I stepped onto the porch and looked down at the dirt clinging to my feet, I didn't brush it off, I didn't rinse it away, I just went back inside and let it stay.